Hello everyone, this video is a little different. I thought I'd talk about a particular popular culture today, most particularly how SJWs have metastasized into fandoms and hobbies like malignant tumors. To those of us into nerd hobbies in particular like video games, comics, anime, really animation in general, etc., this is old yet still relevant news, but you normies out there probably noticed it in other entertainment. Now, some of us who don't like this trend have started calling these unwelcome intruders tourists, which is likely a reference to the negative stereotypes about literal tourists. You know, those clowns that are disrespectful to local culture and customs and just act rude and entitled in general. I understand why this term is being used and why it's becoming popularized, but I think I have one that is far more accurate and has a bit more oomph to it. And the term I'm referring to that we should use um, is one leftists have used as a racial slur for the past few decades. I'm referring to the term colonizer. Think about it. The term tourist, while it does have negative connotations, also has positive and neutral ones. A tourist is, in a nutshell, a visitor. Visitors can be a good or a bad thing depending on their intentions and behavior, like I said before. A visitor can come and be an inconsiderate jerk that trashes the place, or a visitor can be someone who actually cares about and respects the local culture and maybe wants to learn more about it while having a bit of fun. A colonizer is a visitor of sorts, but one that wants to force their own language and culture and customs on the locals to change them while having little or no understanding of it. The Spanish, for example, destroyed many of the written records of the Aztecs and Maya because they deemed the writings satanic. Does that sound familiar? Now, if you've been paying any attention for the last decade or so, it should. Well, Gamergate is what made this systemic colonization of entertainment by SJWs obvious. This didn't occur overnight. Leftists have been colonizing Hollywood, academia, and other cultural institutions long before they sunk their claws into the nerd hobbies. I've been referring to that before the 2010s were mostly niche hobbies. Nearly every reality denying, civilization ruining theory that has come out of the far left over the past several decades has come from academic pseudo intellectual walking, talking examples of Dunning Kruger effect with more time and grant money on their hands in actual sense. As the rot has built up slowly over the decades, it's gradually seeped into and poisoned the mainstream as conservatives, centrists, and even many libertarians, and especially those on the center left, have either played defense or been asleep at the switch completely. The barbarians of the gates weren't just camping out or hurling rocks these past several decades. They were sending spies to infiltrate. Before the 2010s, nobody saw entertainment as political because no sane, rational person wanted one of the few escapes they have from a world that's often cruel, depressing, and soul crushing to be politicized. But we're not dealing with people who are sane, rational, or even making the most rudimentary attempt at good faith. We're dealing with mentally deranged, busybody Karens that want to make everyone else miserable because of their own insecurities and inadequacies. I never thought I would ever believe this in a million years, but thanks to these colonizers, I now believe that the only way to secure fandoms from this kind of rot is aggressive gatekeeping combined with supporting indie companies and other non-woke alternatives to this insanity, as well as targeted boycotts of companies that bend the knee to the colonizers. Now, that doesn't mean I believe we should shut out all the normies, reflexively dismiss even the slightest criticism of our preferred media, or be mean to people just because. You know, basically that we should act like comic book guy from The Simpsons, but it does mean that we need to be vigilant and filter out the people that express interest in joining our hobbies from people that genuinely share our hobbies and the colonizers that want to change them by destroying what made them great. We don't need to listen to screeching, perpetually offended psychopaths who have never showed an interest in these hobbies to begin with. A tourist, as I've said before, is a visitor. We were all tourists when we were testing the waters of a new interest or fandom. Some kept our interests, while others perhaps not. I was a tourist in my early teen years, as I began to express an interest in anime, for example, as this was around the time anime first started to become mainstream. Those of us who kept our decency understood that not everything was made for us in mind, and that's okay. What is not okay are colonizers usurping those hobbies for their own partisan political agendas. There is a reason why Japanese entertainment is kicking the collective asses of Western entertainment, and it's not just because all of a sudden we all became a bunch of weebs who are unwilling to give anything Western a second glance, even if it's good. Western indie companies are all starting to become highly successful because people are looking for alternatives that have not been tainted by woke propaganda. A good example of this is the Rippaverse. Their first comic, I Saw #1, just by itself, selling over 3.7 million um, so far. There's no reason why Western entertainment can't or shouldn't match Japanese entertainment for audiences looking for non woke alternatives. The bad news in regard to Japanese media, however, is how Western vocalizers like Jamie Marchi, the so called main scriptwriter for Funimation, have been butchering it by putting in woke garbage that has little, if anything, to do with the original intent of the Japanese dialogue. The same Jamie Marchi, who's recently admitted on Twitter to not knowing how to speak Japanese. Not only are the vocalizers malicious, they're outright incompetent as well in many cases. I recently learned that translator and scriptwriter are two different job titles at dubbing companies, which begs the question of why. I know English and Japanese are two different languages, and certain words and phrases can be difficult to translate, but is it so much to ask to actually have dialogue that's as close as possible to the original intent of the original language? Call me crazy or whatever, but I think that if someone's going to work in anime dubbing, that they should have qualifications, other than going a few rounds on Chris Sabat's casting couch. Don't bring up criticism to this canceled pig, though, because she's got a hoo-ha, and everyone that criticizes her is an incel that can't get laid. So if I deflected accountability by referencing my genitalia, I'd probably be put on a registry, but, well, you know, if they didn't have double standards, they'd have no standards at all. Japan apparently has noticed this and is starting to use AI to translate, which isn't a perfect solution to this because AI's got its own faults, but is still an improvement over the commie vocalizers putting in their idpol BS. So, pardon me while I play the smallest violin when these hacks and eventually end up getting fired. But art's always been political. These lying gremlins will vomit out of their hideous NPC mouths while conveniently ignoring the difference between entertainment having political themes to advance the plot and blatant partisan propaganda to insult its own audience. Yes, propaganda is not new in entertainment. Nearly all of it had some of it in World War II, for example, but at least the most of it remembered that it still had to be somewhat entertaining. Not to mention, of course, this statement blatantly ignoring the countless examples of apolitical art. Some of us have made the mistake of assuming that once hobbies become mainstream that they're doomed to such a fate when they're poisoned by colonizers. But I don't share this pessimism. It's true that hobbies, once they become mainstream, become more vulnerable to this toxic influence as out-of-touch corpos attempt to reach for phantom audiences by thinking that if they pander to colonizers at the expense of true fans that they'll be more successful than ever, though recent evidence indicates that this is completely unsustainable. Disney is dying. They've stretched themselves way too thin by buying everything in sight and mishandling many of their newly acquired properties. Their record with Star Wars, for example, while not all bad, has been mixed. Their bungling of the sequel trilogy as well as offhand dismissal of the old expanded universe has alienated a lot of fans. Successes such as The Mandalorian indicate a degree of hope, but there are some toxic influences, however, such as Kathleen Kennedy, that have got to go. Disney's biggest mistake, however, is in pandering to the woke cult, with their fights with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis being particularly ill-advised. Not every consumer is a raging leftist. Most are centrists or apolitical who are just exhausted by the whole thing. The fastest growing political orientation is independent, after all, as Americans grow increasingly disgusted by partisan politics. AAA video game companies have been engaging in this baffling practice these past few years or so, where they make their female characters as hideous as possible in the name of realism. Ironically, many of these designs are modeled after real women, yet in most cases the finished product looks worse than the models they're based on. This, along with increasingly bloated, wasteful budgets, excessive use of microtransactions, rushing out incomplete games to market to fix them later with DLC patches and other shady practices, have gotten so out of the hand that we'll probably see another gaming crash in our lifetime. This meme I created, linked in the description, is a comparison of some real life women and video game characters they were supposedly modeled after. I don't know about you, but if I was one of those models, I'd feel insulted and probably wouldn't want to work for any of these companies again. The second example, which is the main female playable character of the upcoming Fable game, is especially egregious. She looks like Fiona from Shrek if her parents were brother and sister. Even the Habsburg family, despite their generations of inbreeding, aren't nearly this hideous. These coloners and the pandering corpos have no respect for us, and as a result, many of them are going to go out of business, and quite frankly are going to deserve what they get. The shareholders in these companies should sue for their blatant abandonment of their fiduciary duties. Like many fads, this woke fad is going to pass, but in the meantime we should hasten its end, and of course plan to rebuild once it all comes crashing down. So, ladies and gents, pass the matches and lighter fluid. This may take a while.